Chinese icon, English icon, and French, the French icon. Hello again, everyone, and I'd like to welcome the participants to the second panel of the Middle East and North Africa region, part of the conference celebrating the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Refugees and of the adoption of the Statute of the High Commissioner for Office for Refugees. This second session is about international cooperation in the face of the Syrian refugee crisis. Most particularly, the Syrian refugee crisis is a test for international refugee law, to the test for host countries, for countries of resettlement, but it is generally a test for international refugee law and for the international refugee regime, of which UNHCR and the statute are parts, are fundamental pieces. We in the statute, in fact, in the statute, you have a paragraph that says that the Office of the High Commissioner, or the High Commissioner himself, at the time it was only in masculine, so it is said he, shall administer any funds, public or private, which he receives for assistance to refugees, and shall distribute them among the private and, as appropriate, public agencies which he deems best qualified to administer such assistance. And then in another paragraph, the statute says that apart from the functioning of the Office of the High Commissioner, the budget of the United Nations will not fund any other activity of UNHCR, but rather that other expenditures relating to the activities of the High Commissioner shall be financed by voluntary contributions. Of course, funds may also and have also been provided to host states. Additionally, in the first panel, we heard Tamiraz Fakhouri speak about the importance of the support provided by the European Union to refugees hosted by Lebanon at the time that Parastu Hassouri referred to the negative impact of the EU externalization policy. And finally, Mohammed Dairi referred to the drop, to the spectacular, and not only Mohammed Dairi, Parastu, Tamiraz referred to the spectacular drop, to the death, in the words of Parastu, of resettlement, which is also a form of international cooperation. To discuss all these issues, we have three prominent experts and friends of UNHCR, personal friends, but above all experienced researchers, experienced policymakers, experienced policy implementers in cooperation in protection and in cooperation policy related to refugees. We will first listen to the intervention of Shadin Khalaf. Shadin is at present the senior policy advisor of UNHCR in the Middle East and North Africa, and she leads the regional policy analysis and design. She has spearheaded and pioneered innovative partnerships with civil society and academia in the region, all aimed targeted at the protection and at the ensuring of livelihoods for refugees. The second speaker will be Jinan Bastaki, who is an assistant professor of international law at the United Arab Emirates University. Professor Bastaki researches the use of force, forced migration policy, durable solution for refugees, and informal measures undertaken by states not parties to the 1951 convention. She has won an award of the International Institute for Humanitarian Law and ICRC in respect of her paper on nationality-based detention and asylum seekers. Last but not least, as we did in the first panel, we have left the senior policymakers at the state level. Minister Dairi talked in the panel on policies and institutions. Minister Merikawar, Dr. Merikawar, is the former Jordanian minister for planning and international cooperation. And as such, of course, she had to deal directly with policy of cooperation in general with Jordan and specifically with the policies aimed at the support of refugees. But Dr. Kawar is also a former senior official of the United Nations system, of the International Labour Organization more specifically, and she has worked in several functions in the ILO, including that of the director of the Office for East Africa in Dar es Salaam. So now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Shadin Khalaf, and I will ask the speakers, if possible, to confine themselves to speaking in 10 minutes so that we have a discussion, a debate amongst the participants and with the audience, and so that also I have, if you allow me, 5 minutes at the end to wrap up the two panels. Ms. Shadin Khalaf, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Awad. It is sincerely an honor and a pleasure to be part of this group and to be speaking together with such distinguished friends and colleagues. And I'm really delighted to be a part of this. I am, as I hope you know, a strong believer in and supporter of the role of academia in responding to such major crises as the ones that we have been facing over the past few years. So I really commend the role of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies and AUC and the many other academic partners in the region with whom we've been working with on this. Dr. Awad, you shared some thoughts from the previous panel, which I caught, unfortunately, only bits and pieces of, but I think some of the main points that were made are definitely ones that I wanted to raise myself, and those being the fact that the crises in the region successively, but most definitely the Syria crisis, has really helped shape and reformulate the global refugee protection regime in an unprecedented way. And as we've seen over the years, an evolution has continued to happen that led in many ways, many attribute actually, the discussions about the Global Compact on Refugees to some of the major changes and challenges that were unfolding on the ground in the countries that were dealing with the Syria refugee crisis. So it's important to note that and to contextualize it and to think about the global reach of the crisis in the region and the extent to which it has really ramifications way beyond its borders. The other thing that I just want to say before I begin, before I get into the more substantive part of my thoughts, is that just to structure a little bit what I would like to share. So I want us to think through together three things: the policy evolution in the region in response to the Syria crisis. What has changed? What has evolved? How has it given us reason to hope, in fact, for the future, and to think through about solutions to the displacement challenges that we see? The second point I'd like us to think through is partnerships, how they have also been transformed over the past few years through what we've seen in the Syria crisis. And the third element is how we can think together more towards the future about more thinking about prevention and peace building, and incorporating those elements more into how we respond to displacement moving forward. So if you allow me, I will dig right into the first point of the policy evolution, and just to frame the responses in the region and the policy frameworks by mentioning that, of course, many of us know that there is a long-standing and rich cultural and historic legacy of asylum in this region. And what we saw over the years is that there was a direction towards formalizing that, structuring it, and making sure that it becomes, to a certain degree, a little bit more predictable, a little bit more, let's say, regulated. And we have seen some progress to varying degrees in the countries that have responded to the Syria crisis, and the huge numbers of Syrians, the over 5 million Syrians who are displaced in the region, and who continue to need a great deal of protection and assistance. But what we've seen is that the policy frameworks have, by and large, been overall conducive and overall accepting and applying the general principles of refugee law and international human rights law. So what we saw initially is that access to protection and territory for those fleeing safety was very much upheld. Over time, we saw that access to basic services such as health and education and many others was sustained and upheld. Access to employment, or the right to employment and to livelihoods, came in some places more than others over time, and we've seen some examples where that has in fact been quite prominent. And most recently, over the past year, what we saw is that access to preventive measures and treatment for the COVID-19 pandemic was also made available by and large throughout the countries responding to the Syria crisis. And now, very currently, what we're seeing is advocacy continue to happen for inclusion of refugees in the vaccination campaigns that are beginning or have begun in some countries. And I'll just refer quickly to Jordan, which was mentioned a couple of days ago by the High Commissioner, and the inclusion of refugees among the first groups to be vaccinated here in Amman or throughout Jordan was very welcome and very much appreciated by UNHCR overall. And then as we look forward to the policy frameworks moving into the future, knowing that this situation is one that is protracted and that solutions to the refugee crisis, to the Syrian refugees crisis, are hinging, of course, on political resolution to the situation inside Syria. What we need to think about more carefully are social safety nets and social protection elements that help us build sustainability and comprehensive elements into the response framework. So that was just a quick overview of how the policy framework has, to a large extent, looked over the past few years. The second element that I wanted to touch upon is partnerships and how they have really shaped the understanding of global solidarity and responsibility sharing through the establishment of the 3RP, which is the flagship regional platform for cooperation, coordination, advocacy, and fundraising. So it is a tool, a multifaceted tool that has grown to enormous proportions to cover the needs of all the millions of Syrian refugees, as well as the impacted host communities, which are about 4.8 million individuals. And what we've seen is that the 3RP opened the space and opened the door for a very wide range of new and innovative other forms of engagement. And as I mentioned earlier, also led to a rethink of global solidarity. And over the past couple of years, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Refugee Forum have built on a lot of the principles that came out of that, and have also reaffirmed the importance of engaging a multi-stakeholder platform of partners and actors in the response. So this is no longer, or these are all no longer situations or crises that can be resolved by any one government or any one entity or organization. So there really is a reaffirmation of the essential nature of multi-stakeholder and multilateral responses. And throughout the past few years, we have really worked very closely with many of the partners that you have been, many of the speakers that are part of this debate, this webinar. And we have engaged academics, civil society actors, faith-based organizations, the private sector, and really opened up the space for advocacy and support and engagement in innovative ways that likewise build sustainability and localization into the response. The third element that I will touch upon briefly is perhaps the importance of thinking ahead to the future of the region, knowing also that it's a very conflict-prone region, that the fault lines for the geopolitical fault lines continue to move, the alliances continue to shift, and that this will continue to have an impact on how and when conflicts are or are not resolved, and as a result, the extent to which refugees can continue to be hosted in the countries where they are. So what we're trying to think through is how our work on social cohesion can be building on or planting the seeds for peace building in the future, when hopefully the day comes when refugees can return to their country of origin, and how we can continue to work on stabilization of the context in the region, and use the analysis that is produced by research and academics and other think tanks and similar institutions to help us improve, fine-tune, strengthen our responses, and build early warning systems into how we respond on the ground operationally, and think through prevention also. How can we ensure that our efforts and our humanitarian interventions and our linking up with development actors such as the World Bank and others are helping us think through the prevention agenda and the peace building agenda. So I think, I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I just want to perhaps leave us with the thought that over time, what we've also seen is that the linkage to the Sustainable Development Goals has been critical, and that the need for the humanitarian response to be strongly linked up to development and the developmental trajectory of the region, and looking at the contributions that refugees can bring, not only the responsibility that they present, is an essential way at looking at the future of the region and thinking through the possibilities and not only the challenges. And I'll end with a quote, if I may, that I think many of us were watching the inauguration yesterday, and the quote by the young poet Amanda Gorman really struck me, and she ended her poem with these words: "For there is always light if we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." So I think this is an encouraging statement for us to continue to think about how we can continue to address the very challenging situations on the ground in a collaborative, inclusive, and comprehensive manner. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much to Shahdan Khalaf for her contribution. She has brought us her experience, her broad perspective on the region. She has talked about very positively, and we are glad to know about the refugees that were encompassed by COVID vaccination measures in Jordan. This is one aspect of international cooperation. She has talked to us about partnerships, about the future. I will keep from making any comments now. I will leave that for the questions later, for the dialogue that we'll try to set up between participants and with the audience. As for now, I will ask Professor Jenan Bastaki to please make her contribution.
Firstly, thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, as well as to the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies, and as well as my co-panelists. I really enjoyed your intervention, Shadin, so it's good that to see you here as well. So what I'm going to be speaking about is about providing protection for Syrian refugees within the framework of the GCR and in uh, countries that are not party to the 1951 convention, where I see the most potential, particularly in the Gulf Arab states. Like Shadin spoke about initially, but the context that led to the adoption and the endorsement of the Global Compact for Refugees. So, in a sense, we know that the majority of the world's refugees, even today, they live in neighboring host states that are in general low-income countries, and due to the prolonged stay and at times restrictive policies, many of these refugees are moving on from the host state to third countries. And we saw, in a sense, the inadequacy of kind of the old way of doing things, and that the regime that we had in place definitely had, let's say, to put it mildly, room for improvement. And so, in a sense, this is why we saw the Global Compact for Refugees come with four key aims that are obviously very important for what we're seeing today with the Syrian crisis, as well as other forced migration and refugee issues. So the four key aims, as many of you already know, are easing pressures on host countries, enhancing refugee self-reliance, expanding access to third country solutions, and supporting conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. So I think I would like to focus here in my intervention on the first three aims: easing pressures on host states, enhancing refugees' self-reliance, and expanding access to third country solutions, and especially the third one, because I think there's a lot of potential for the GCR in states that are not party to the 1951 convention to, in a sense, choose those initiatives and those projects that enable refugees access to areas where they might not have had the access before, because these countries, for example, don't recognize refugees, or they're not party to the 1951 convention, but can establish certain initiatives under the or within the guise of the framework of the GCR. So in terms of the region that I want to specifically, or the sub-region that I'd like to speak about, obviously is the Gulf Cooperation Council. So the countries that make up the Gulf Cooperation Council are Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And so these, the GCC in general as a bloc, they're in terms of refugees, they are well known for their or as of the biggest humanitarian aid donors, right, and including to refugee hosting states. So just to give some numbers, we have Bahrain, for example. They established an educational complex which consists of 4 schools to serve refugee students in Jordan. They established housing units, a basic school for girls in Irbid. Kuwait has been also one of the biggest donors to the Syrian refugee issue since 2013. They have contributed close to 350 million US dollars to the UNHCR. They've also co-hosted certain donor events, including the 2016 Supporting Syria in the Region conference, where they pledged 300 million US dollars, and including other initiatives. You have Oman, even though their contributions have been smaller, but still $22 million in 2014, as well as other campaigns to help refugees. Qatar, in addition, they've also provided assistance to refugees in host states as well as IDPs in Syria. They've given over 10 million US dollars in 2018 to support, vulnerable Syrian refugee families living in Jordan and Lebanon, as well as specific contributions to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency in Syria, to help Palestine refugees in Syria. We have Saudi Arabia as well, who are also among the top donors, and they've also contributed to support for education for Syrian children. The UAE as well, they finance a specific refugee camp in Jordan, and they've also contributed over 530 million in humanitarian aid and development assistance to help the Syrian crisis. And so this is all external aid. This is all aid and help to refugee hosting countries. However, internally, we find that most of the countries making up the GCC, they don't have laws to regulate the status of refugees, nor are they resettlement countries. At the same time, we have evidence that the numbers of Syrians in many of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries has risen since the outbreak of hostilities in Syria. And so has the GCR, since these countries have all endorsed the GCR, has it somehow made a difference, and what potential is there for the GCR to make a greater difference in these countries? So in terms of the GCR, so obviously, we all know there's the GCR website where you can see kind of the contributions and the pledges. And if we see, for example, in terms of the GCC countries, Bahrain has one pledge, which is to continue financial pledges. Kuwait has 4 pledges, and they all have to do with, earmarking certain donations. So for example, 150 million to the Yemen situation, 22 million to Syrian and Rohingya refugees, and so on and so forth. Oman didn't have any pledges, but then Qatar had 3 pledges, Saudi Arabia had 1 pledge, the UAE had 2 pledges, but all of these pledges are in a sense a continuation of what was before. So specifying certain humanitarian aid to refugee hosting countries, and as well as for internally displaced persons, in order to help them for education, livelihood, and other needs. So is there potential, is there a place for the GCR to expand this kind of aid, and not just extend the aid that already exists, but actually to provide further solutions in the form of complementary pathways to third countries? So like I mentioned before, in many of the GCC countries, we have seen a rise in the numbers of Syrians that have come to some of the GCC countries, usually under either a work permit, a work visa, or to join, let's say, a breadwinner who was already living in the country. And these countries, so most of the GCC countries, like I mentioned, they don't have specific laws regulating the status of refugees, with the exception of Qatar that passed a law on organizing political asylum in 2018. The UAE offered an amnesty as well in 2018 to those who were overstaying the residency permit, and they created a specific category of visas for people who are from war-torn countries. Colloquially or just locally, it's known as visa al-kawarith, right? The disasters visa. But basically, it allows people from certain countries, and now the countries are Syria, Yemen, and Libya, to basically stay in the countries, to stay in the country, to have their residency renewed as long as there is a conflict in that country, and they cannot respond. Saudi Arabia, they also had this initiative where they gave temporary permits as well to Yemenis, and allowed temporary work permits for Syrians. Now, even though these are some welcome initiatives, at the same time, we see that people have also fallen through the gaps. So, for example, even though there was this initiative in the UAE to help those who are from war-torn countries who cannot return to those countries, some had fallen through the gaps because they could not get, for example, their passports renewed. If they could not get their passports renewed, it was hard for them to apply for the visa, or, for example, it was outside of the time period to apply for the visa. So where do we see the potential for the GCR? So one of the biggest ways that we can perhaps expand the implementation of the GCR is through, I would say, labor migration. And at least 3 of the 6 GCC countries, they're made up of a majority of expatriates. Many people come to these countries for work opportunities, for livelihood opportunities, and there isn't the same type of tension with competition, for example, for jobs and things like that we find in other countries, where it's seen, welcoming refugees there would be competition with the local population. It might cause a strain on resources, and so on and so forth. However, labor migration can be complementary to other solutions, and we have already seen that many of the Syrians who have, at least from my knowledge and research in the UAE, those who have arrived did arrive through work permits. And even though, for example, COVID exacerbated a lot of, the joblessness that unfortunately came as a result of the pandemic and then the ensuing issues that were caused by it, there were still many people who were able to retain their jobs. And so there is, I think, a potential gap here that the GCR in a sense, can exploit in a positive way, obviously, in order to have this win-win situation where these countries are already hosts to huge expatriate populations, but at the same time creating perhaps a specific pathway for those who are refugees, and if these countries, they don't recognize refugees in that way, but de facto refugees, or people from war-torn countries, or whatever category they would like to create, with, of course, the added protection and perhaps working with the UNHCR to ensure that once this category of persons, or if this category of persons happens to lose their job, for example, cannot find another job, that there are minimum protections that are installed in order to enable their continued protection and their continued accommodation in these states. And I'm going to end here and then perhaps wait for any questions or interventions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bastaki, for your intervention. I think we will get back to you with questions, and we will establish this exchange between participants. I now turn to Dr. Mary Kawar. Dr. Mary Kawar, as I said, was the Minister of International Cooperation, and she has a large experience in international cooperation as represented in the international United Nations system. So we will listen to her about her experience and her perspective, her opinion about international cooperation provided to Jordan and more generally. Dr. Kawar, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here. Thank you for including me in this very important event. I will be mostly reflecting on Jordan in my talk.
Dr. Kawar, can you please put on your video?
Video's not on. Wait a minute. Okay.
It was on a few minutes ago. Yeah, now, okay.
Now. Is it on now?
No, it's off again. It was on a few seconds.
Sorry, can you bear with me, because I have my notes in front of me, and it seems I cannot have my notes and my
I think you can.
Screen. Give me 1 second, please.
Sure.
Okay. All right. So, if I can speak like this. So, as UNHCR is celebrating a 20-year anniversary, I would like to remind people here that we are also celebrating 10 years since the eruption of the Syrian refugee crisis. So someone who came to Jordan or Lebanon at 1 year is now 10 years old. Someone who was 10 years is now 20 years, mainly in adulthood. So the percentage of Syrian refugees in neighbor countries, it's quite high. In Jordan, we have 650,000 registered. And many more maybe which are not registered. This means that 1 in every 15 Jordanian, 1 in every 15 residing currently in Jordan is actually a refugee. My colleague Shadan mentioned that last year we had media reports of the first vaccinated refugee in Jordan, and it was a vaccination administered by UNHCR and in Jordan. So as a Jordanian, I was actually quite proud, because it has been a country that has been historically hosting refugees. And I was also filled with gratitude for UNHCR as an organization that managed not to only protect and provide services for refugees, but also to maintain and push for dignity and inclusion. And inclusion of the COVID-19 vaccination is the name of the game today and in the media reports of last week. During my presentation, I want to demonstrate how this crisis had pushed the bar in terms of a coordinated international response and cooperation in my country, Jordan. My colleagues have mentioned it in general, but I want to demonstrate about Jordan in particular. In fact, I think Jordan was a testing ground for new modality for a joint response, which may have directly influenced the Global Compact on Refugees that highlighted the need for robust, sustained support for countries bearing the largest responsibility for the protection of livelihoods and refugees. Before I start, however, I want to pose the question as to what is different about the Syrian refugee crisis that render this international attention and cooperation. We do know that the Syrian refugee crisis represents one of the largest, most protracted, most and complicated humanitarian emergency in our modern times. But more than that, I think what was different is the proximity to Europe and the mass exodus of refugees towards Europe. And we do know that the European Union did not take a unified stand. Germany behaved in a way, Hungary behaved in a different way. Also, we had the emergence of ISIS, where many fighters actually were coming from Europe. So it was a very unusual crisis that needed a cooperative approach as the stakes were very high with very complicated geopolitics. So the international dimension and the foreign policy agenda of the particular countries, everybody was kind of very involved and concerned. Now, what was happening in Jordan? The impact of the Syrian refugees on Jordan was undeniable. At the onset of the refugee crisis, the same time the country was emerging from a financial crisis of 2008, was emerging from the Arab Spring. Suddenly, major trade routes to the northern border of Syria and eastern border of Iraq were blocked. It's already a country that is poor in resources such as water and energy. We had decreased economic growth, spiraling unemployment, increased external indebtedness. So the situation, this is where international cooperation came in, because we needed the support of the international community, and actually the international community needed the support of Jordan to keep refugees in the neighborhood. So allow me to give you an overview, or what maybe I can call chronology, of what I am saying as it was a testing ground. It is things that Shadan alluded to, but I will say it in a different way. So not long after the eruption of the Syrian crisis, neighboring countries were being flooded with refugees. All of them were fragile and vulnerable. Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. So there was a need for a new approach to combine the development and the humanitarian response in what came out as the regional refugee resilience plan, the 3RP. So this was, of course, a coordinated mechanism for strategy, programming, advocacy, fundraising, etc. But what was most important about it, in my view, and as someone who worked also, if I put my hat of the United Nations, is that it was coordinated by UNHCR and UNDP, the humanitarian and the development arm of the UN system. So it was a plan that actually this humanitarian development nexus that we have been talking about for so long actually became a reality with the 3RP, and where we bridged this gap and the two arms could now work together. Now we know that the 3RP had a chapter for each country, and we had the Jordan response plan, which is part of the 3RP. So this is led by the government. It represents a genuine model of a strong, long-standing partnership between Jordan as a host country and the international community. All of it, bilaterals, multilaterals, international NGOs, development banks, etc. It also tried to align, and this is very important, the national strategies of the country and undertake a systems approach. So what do I mean by that? So while the Jordan Resilience Plan was divided into a humanitarian and resilience parts, humanitarian and development that is, Syrian refugees could have access to all public services And Jordan will have an opportunity to improve and expand its public services as long as they provide access to Syrian refugees. So this is what a system approach is. Let us improve our social and physical infrastructure. Let us expand that in order to be able to provide the services to refugees. Now, of course, in local communities hosting refugees were also supported through local economic development projects that benefit both groups. Putting the 3RP and the JRP together, we also had an international tool, and which is the Brussels Conference. So this is at the international level to keep the Syrian crisis at the top of the international agenda and sustain the support for the 3RP and JRP was the annual Brussels Conference. 220 was the fourth conference. Again, this was co-hosted by the UN and the EU. The UN was concerned about the political solutions, the implementing the Security Council Resolution 2254, and also the EU had a specific interest in ensuring that we can support Jordan and Syria and Lebanon as long as we can manage the migration flow into Europe. So it had a political objective. The Brussels conferences had a political advantage, but it was also an opportunity for the donor community to pledge their support for the Syrians and for neighboring countries. Now, however, there's a specific aspect related to Jordan, in addition to that, because these were regional tools, that is called the Jordan Compact. This came about in 2016 as Jordan was still suffering from the economic strain of limited resources. It was reaching its maximum capacity, increasing deficit, external debt, not to mention the problem with the security issues in northern and eastern borders. So in fact, if you think about it, Jordan was the only stable country at the time, but it was struggling to remain so. So we needed the security, to improve the security situation, but also sometimes the security situation is internal. If you have spiraling unemployment, decreasing incomes as subsidies were being lifted, you need to ensure that the country also stays economically and socially stable. So Jordan and the international community needed to develop a new cooperative model, a new paradigm that focuses on economic development to benefit both Syrians and Jordanians. It was beyond the JRP, I think. So, okay. So there was a conference in 2016 in London that had three interlinked objectives: turning the Syrian refugee crisis into a development opportunity that attracts new investments and open up EU markets, okay, with simplified rules of origin, so Jordanian private sector can more easily export to Europe, while Jordan will open its labor market to Syrians. Mobilizing sufficient grants and concessionary financing to support the macroeconomic framework and address Jordan's financing needs as part of Jordan entering a new extended facility with the IMF. And of course, rebuilding and strengthening the host community aspect of the Jordan Resilience Plan. Meanwhile, the Jordanian government committed to a reform agenda to improve the business and investment environment and followed the advice of the IMF. And a fundamental part of the Jordan Compact is the agreement to facilitate access to Jordanian exports while removing the obstacles to Jordanian access to labor market in specific sectors, which is agriculture, manufacturing, and construction. Now, operationalizing this was heavy on the details, such as the numbers of the number of the permits provided to Syrian refugees depends on the level of international support that Jordanians will get, etc. Let me not go into this in detail, and let me conclude by saying that the international community converged to assist Jordan in managing the Syrian refugee crisis, as it was a country providing a global public good. and keeping the refugees in the neighborhood, so to speak. And in fact, some of the support was conditional. At the same time, the country was supported financially. Today, Jordan is one of the top recipients of aid from countries like Canada or Japan or Germany or US. We even have new non-traditional partners assisting Jordan, like Netherlands or Sweden or Austria. These were not traditional partners. I also need to say that Jordan is not, as a middle income economy, was not eligible to ODA fund, and this was lifted. So looking specifically at the modality of cooperation in terms of 3RP, JRP, Jordan Compact, one can say that while the previous refugee crisis, if we compare to the international response of previous refugee crises has been piecemeal, unbalanced, and humanitarian aid often inadequate. But the case of Jordan was different. It focused on the resilience and economic sustainability of the country, hand in hand with the humanitarian assistance. It also focused on sharing responsibility. And we know this is the foundation of our modern system for protecting refugees and the backbone of UNHCR's Statute's objectives. So I would finally say that we have an approach and a momentum to inspire a fundamental shift in how we engage with refugees in other countries. Now, of course, the reality on the ground is far from perfect, you know, the devil is always in the details. However, I can confidently say that its an approach is what the Global Compact on Refugees has been proposing, which is to strengthen cooperation and solidarity with refugees and the affected host communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you very much, Dr. Kawar, for your contribution. You have dealt with many issues, and I think we will get back to them to discuss several among them in the discussion, which will start now. I will not say which, but you may find which issues I'm stressing in the questions or in the comments that I will ask Shadin, Jinan, and yourself to address. Shadin, you mentioned, I have two questions for you. One is about what you said, and I'm familiar with your efforts to bring academia, civil society organizations, the private sector together. And this makes me think of transnational action to address a transnational phenomenon. After all, refugees movements are transnational. There is one event that produces outcomes in another, one event in one country, in one territory, that produces outcomes in another territory. This is the perfect definition of transnational. And therefore, what you said is that, in fact, governments alone and states alone cannot address transnational phenomena, and therefore your focus on non-state actors which can act transnationally. I'd like to know what you think about that. And I'd like also to tell us more about what Mary Kawar had just told us about the work, the cooperation between UNDP and UNHCR in putting into practice the R2P in Jordan, and then how also the United Nations systems and international parties worked with Jordan, because Jordan had its own plan, the Jordan response plan. So I will give you 4 or 5 minutes to address these two questions, and I may get back to you again after Jinan Bastaki and Mary Kawar make a second intervention. Please, Shadin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. On the first question in relation to transnational phenomena, I fully agree with you that what we witnessed, and in general with displacement, this is what we see, that a conflict in one country results in an outflow towards another and a huge socioeconomic impact on and obviously demographic impact and a whole host of other impacts on others. And in general, actually, what we've seen over the past few years is that globalization has happened on all levels, including the movement of people, the movement of information, the movement of money, the movement of goods. But when it came to the movement of people, this is where we saw somehow more barriers coming up over the past few years. However, having said that, the role of what we call now multi-stakeholder actors, so these emerging actors on the scene of humanitarian response, is that they are less restricted by let's say, national priorities and national agendas. Many of them are working towards issues of more of a regional or global nature. A lot of them are built on advocacy towards rights-based approaches to responses. So that is really their goal, and that is their methodology, and that is their approach. So that they have a built-in structure and mechanism that is already in a way transcending national borders. The second point in relation to that is that we also found that there were, unfortunately, silos in how these multi-stakeholders interacted. So the private sector, for a very long time, was not very involved in responding to displacement issues. There was a bit of a barrier there. They were not really closely linked up with academics, not closely linked up with civil society, not related at all to faith-based organizations, etc. So what we tried to do is break down these silos between the various stakeholders and see what they had in common and make the business case, so to speak, for them coming together to address displacement and to be more involved in the humanitarian space and to open up the humanitarian space. And this required us to also think differently as a UN agency in the response, because given the urban nature of the displacement, we had to open up and to involve these new partners and to make sure that we were expanding our reach and working together with as many different actors as possible, given the fact that it affected all of them indirectly or directly one way or another. So I hope that maybe sheds a little bit more light on this. It wasn't without challenges, I have to say. It was really an uphill battle to bring these very different stakeholders together around the same issues, around the same discussion, and to speak the same language, because it was quite different, and to also bring refugees themselves to the table. So we tried very consistently to make sure that we had refugees present in discussions with the private sector, for instance, and to bring women entrepreneurs among refugees with successful businesswomen from across the region to bridge that gap and to make sure that the language was similar and that there was a commonality of purpose there. In relation to the second question, Dr. Awad, about the 3RP and how the humanitarian and the development arms of the UN came together to respond to this crisis, it was also not an easy process. I think that that is quite known, because these are two very different systems. And I think UNHCR works at a very different pace, let's say, from many other organizations, due to the nature of the humanitarian emergency response mechanisms that we have in place, and the different nature of development processes, which are long-term, they are more drawn out, they require longer-term building up of relationships. So the paces and structures and approaches of some of the partner agencies that were involved were different and required, again, some internal adaptation and revision of how we engage. But at the same time, I think there was no way around this partnership. It was absolutely essential to link up the long-term needs of the host communities and the refugees and the governments together, in order to be able to address both the immediate needs as well as the future needs and the future state or vision of what the region would look like. And we see that also now as we work together with agencies or organizations like ESCWA in thinking through the UN development system reform. What does that mean for the humanitarian actors in the region? How do we link up better? How do we synchronize our objectives and the way we work and who we work with to be to have more of to be speaking with a common voice as a UN system, and to really be linking up at the levels of the vision, at the level of the implementation, and at the level of the impact on the ground.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sheldon, for these additions to your interventions and to what we listened to from Dr. Kawar. Let me now turn to Dr. Bastaki. She came up with an interesting idea about complementarity between refugee or between asylum policy and labor migration policy in order to protect those who are in need of international protection. Let me also emphasize something that she probably wanted to say, but the GCC countries, in fact, the first conference to support Syrian refugees was held in Kuwait, as I remember, before it moved to Europe. So there is before it moved to Brussels and London. So there is an effort made by GCC countries, but the question of complementarity between labor migration policy and asylum policy is in fact put into practice before it was conceptualized. So how do you envision that? How do you consider that from the perspective of protection? You're an international lawyer, and you work in international refugee law in particular. So how do you assess that from the perspective of protection? And let me add here that Mary Kawar also signaled something very important, in fact, that there is complementarity of policies because you have asylum policy, you have foreign policy. Countries provide cooperation and funds for foreign policy objectives, not only for humanitarian. So, what do you make out of all of this? And what is your perspective on how policies are complementary in the GCC sub-region, and again from the perspective of protection, which is your specialty.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, I wanted to touch upon it, but I didn't know how much time I had during my intervention. So
now you have 4 to 5 minutes.
Okay, excellent. So in a sense, what you're saying is correct. Like a lot of these countries, not all of them, but a lot of these countries are in a sense open to people who are, de facto refugees, even if they're not considered refugees in the countries where they go to. And I think the idea behind kind of this labor migration that in a sense is already happening is to perhaps formalize it a bit in a way in order to ensure that those who do undertake this route or this path of labor migration can then also be protected when and or not when, hopefully not when, but if they do end up having to lose their job. So like I mentioned before, the UAE did this temporary initiative in which those who are already in the country, many of them were had come either after the war or even before that, and they have jobs and employment in the UAE, and then for whatever reason they might have lost their jobs, and then they were staying in the country irregularly. And so for a period of about 5 or 6 months, anybody who was overstaying their visa or their visa had expired for whatever reason could apply for this specific type of residency. And so in a sense, I would say it's merging between this labor migration, as well as having specific protection policies that recognizes that this person comes from a country that they are not able to return to, whether you want to call them a refugee or not call them a refugee or give them that status or not, but it's just a recognition that this person cannot go back home. We are obligated as a state not to send them back home because of the principle of non-refoulement, but also perhaps this is something that I would envision in the future to add to that, is to actually make work visas and work permits to be more open to people from certain countries, from refugee-producing states, or people who are living in host countries that are perhaps overcapacitated. Because, like I mentioned, I did recently a study. I published it. Maybe it was in December, looking at specific Gulf countries. More particularly the UAE, and actually looking at the potential, looking at the jobs that are actually available. So the countries in the GCC, sometimes they're known for closing like visas to people from certain countries for a limited period of time and then opening it up again. However, if there was a labor migration program that was applied to people from certain countries or for certain situations, it would ensure at least the regularity, that it's actually more open and it's more consistently open for certain people from certain places. And like I said, maybe this is a bit naive, and I shouldn't be naive as a refugee lawyer, but in a sense, it's optimistic, to look at it and say it's a win-win situation. It's a situation in which the country that's already open to different expatriates and already many internationals come and live and work and they gain a living, but at the same time, you also have people who desperately want to go and live and cannot return back home, can actually go to a place where they can be stable and can in a sense ensure this self-reliance. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Yes, you answered my question, but I have the impression that in fact you are suggesting a category in between, because you say labor migration but with protection. So it would not be the normal migrant worker. It will be the migrant worker who will have some sort of protection. All new ideas are welcome. All new ideas are welcome. They can be discussed, but it's interesting that we did not forget protection, that these are asylum seekers meant to be refugees. They cannot be treated solely as migrant workers, because migrant workers may face difficulty. So you want to add some clauses of protection. Quite an interesting idea. I will get back before the end to Shadon to know what she thinks about that. But thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan. My good friend Mary Kawar, there are quite a few questions to you, but you said about complementarity of policies, and you mentioned foreign policy, and this is something that is to me quite important, and I've been given some thought to it. Mary, you were Minister of Planning and International Cooperation. In Egypt, this has also happened, planning and international cooperation. When you go to the industrialized world, to the global north, you will find Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. You see, so it will be different. It will be different. So it's quite interesting that you brought this up. How international cooperation is envisioned by countries in the global south as opposed to countries in the global north, global north and global south. So I'd like to know something. I'm sure that in your experience you have had to deal with foreign affairs departments and with international organizations, and at times it's not clear whether international organizations should be dealt with by ministers of planning or by ministers of foreign affairs. So this is one question to you. My second question, which also connects with a question from one of our dear participants in the audience, is about the Jordan Compact. The Jordan Compact. What do you see as shortcomings in the Jordan Compact, in particular in the light of its implementation? In February, it will be 5 years since the Jordan Compact was adopted. So to which extent was it realistic? To which extent it contributed to realizing the objectives of Jordan and the objectives of the EU? So this is the third question. I have another question, in fact, but this is more of a procedural type. But this is to Shadin, which I will go back to Shadin with. But my final question to you, Mary, is from one of the participants in the audience also. It's about discussions with IMF in respect of debt restructuring in Jordan. Yeah. And I think this can be seen in the light of what you mentioned about the lack of resources in Jordan, and lack of resources which is probably accentuated by COVID-19 and the slowdown in economic activities in most of the world, and of course the responsibility that refugees represent. I know I have 3 questions to you. You'll probably have 6 minutes rather than 5, since you have 3 questions. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you, Ibrahim. Really good questions. Not enough time to answer. Actually, I love your first question, because as a Minister of Planning and International Cooperation, it was always a struggle. I was coordinating with all the other ministers, and often they don't like that. And it's very easy if you don't have a clear understanding and a very healthy relationship with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, will be stepping on each other's foot all the time. For example, Brussels, you know, 2 ministers go from Jordan, the Planning and International Cooperation and the Foreign Minister. I also was always looking at the fact that financing for development has been changing drastically. And unless you have deep knowledge and specific ministry or a governmental mechanism that understands what is going on in the world of financing for development, a country like Jordan will not do very well. So, for example, while we were used to grants, it was very obvious that we have a bigger role of development banks, of public-private partnerships, of ways to cover public infrastructure where you have different donors and different types of funding. So it's a very evolving area of work, financing for development, that in a country like in the South, I don't think a Ministry of Foreign Affairs will have the dedicated staff, time, and knowledge to do. In terms of the planning part, it was also, as a minister, you find that you have a national plan and then all these sectoral plans, and a very hard time managing between the national and the sectoral. And I think the role of planning itself needs to be rethought in the Global South. We need to go to maybe two-year plans rather than any long-term plans. Anyway, this is my view. I had an idea for the Jordanian government in terms of the planning and the international cooperation, which was for me inspired by the Egyptian model. Because financing for the development these days cannot be separated from private sector development and from development banks who are looking for investments. And I think there should be an alignment between investment and international cooperation. Because after all, the government is looking at, with the budget deficit, how am I funding my public needs? How am I funding and expanding my schools and roads and dams and energy and electricity? So there is a close alignment more and more between investment, private sector, and international cooperation, in my view. So that's for your first question. I hope I answered it. It's really my personal thoughts. Let me now talk about the Jordan Compact. Jordan Compact was very complex. It had to do a lot with the interests of the EU. It was conditional that, okay, you have to open the labor market for Syrians to be able to have access to European markets. And preferably it's the enterprise that is hiring the Syrians that will have this preferential access to Europe. Really complex. Now, I do agree, and as someone who has a background with the ILO, that at the end of the day, refugees need to have access to livelihoods. As I said, this is 10 years now, and refugees need to have access to work. So, but you need to have access to work in a situation where a country is stable, is solid, unemployment is not very high, in a way that is acceptable to the local and host communities. So that is the part that about access to work. But the compact told the Jordanians, within 3 years, we need to have 200,000 work permits. You have to show us evidence of the 200,000 work permits for Syrians. Now, Syrians, and you know, in Jordan, there is social cohesion between Jordanians and Syrians. You know, often they work informally. They don't have any incentive to get an official work permit. Work permits themselves were free, so you might get a work permit the first year, you're not going to go and renew it the next year. So the Jordanians were having a very hard time demonstrating to the Europeans this number of 200,000. So that was another problem with the compact. Another issue related to enterprises, I think at the end of the day, only 10 to 15 Jordanian enterprises, mainly manufacturing of textiles, were able to benefit from the rules of origin and export to Europe. So not a lot of Jordanian private sector was able to benefit. This also is because of the nature of the Jordanian economy. It's small, it's not very competitive. So the will of a traditional family-based medium-sized company is not there. However, even though a very limited number of enterprises benefited, the exports increased from 19 million euros in 2016 to 56 million euros in 2019. So we can say that in terms of export, the impact wasn't so bad. I hope I answered you. I think the jury's still out there about how positive it was, and as a government official, it was something difficult to manage at the time, especially getting the number of work permits. So discussions with the IMF and debt restructuring. The discussions with the IMF weren't about debt restructuring. They were more about, the message was clear from the IMF. You as Jordanians need to do your share of economic reform. From their point of view, we had signed an agreement and we were not doing our share of reform. Now I'm going back to 2016 or 17 when the compact started. So since then, so the idea that you need to have macroeconomic stability, and for that, you need to address major issues. And what are the major issues in Jordan? It is energy. Our electricity company runs on deficit each month. There is no way we can get out of this debt spiral without reforming energy. And it is very costly to reform. However, the government did take a lot of steps in terms of reforming the tax reform, more efficiency also in public procurement, and other such measures to have more macroeconomic stability. Let me stop here, and if there's more questions, I will address them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Kawar. Let me turn to Ms. Khalaf with the question that I put to her a few minutes ago about what she thought of this idea of complementarity between labor migration and refugee and asylum policy, if, or in the absence of a clear asylum policy dedicated to protection, why not resort to labor migration policy, especially if it is reinforced with some protection clauses? I know that this is an idea that deserves some thinking, some research, but what is your first reaction to that?
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. I think it's a tricky question, I have to say, but I think two elements come to mind as I think about it. First of all, the importance of upholding the legal definition of a refugee and maintaining that as the basis for all advocacy and to continue to call for states to respect that and to allow refugees on their territory to be recognized and treated as such. So people who have that claim to being unable to return due to a fear for their life, for that to be recognized. So that continues to be the baseline, obviously. However, having said that, I know that you were also involved, Dr. Ibrahim, with the discussions around the Global Compact on migration. And of course, there is complementarity between the Global Compact on migration and the Global Compact on refugees. But I think they were designed and structured to be kind of two parallel tracks for a reason. So I think the devil is, of course, in the details, and some situations may require closer integration of the principles that guide each of them than others. But I think the importance of ensuring that this refugeehood, in a way, is, or the state of being a refugee and the characteristics that define it and the legal rights that are associated with it are upheld as they should be, I think, would be my first thought. Maybe there can be things that we can discuss potentially with Janan later about things that we can include from labor migration laws that can support this. But I think approaches that blur the lines sometimes may have longer term consequences beyond the specific circumstances that we could not foresee. And so I think we have to think them through very carefully.
Thank you very much, Shadin, especially for recognizing the difficulty of the issue. But frankly, you know, at times you cannot know who is a refugee and who is a migrant. And at times, the same person may be a refugee and a migrant worker at the same time. And therefore, the difficulty of addressing with only, you know, there is this question of regime complexity. Regime complexity where you have one individual or one phenomenon governed by the international refugee regime, international migrant, and international human rights regime. So you have different regimes that go into realizing the objectives probably of each of the regimes. Absolutely. So it is something. I mean, you know, UNHCR has this concept of mixed migration flows. In itself, it is a recognition that some people need protection at first instance, and then they may be sifted, the individuals in need of protection.
And this is an issue, Dr. Ibrahim, if I may, just on that point, where our engagement with academia and academics is vital and important and helps us ask the important and difficult questions and helps us better understand and analyze these positions. So thank you for that.
You know that you're most welcome to our cooperation is always most welcome. I go back to Janan Bastaki, and there is a question to you, in fact, from the audience, not from me. Do you think that your idea of this complementarity, do you think, or did you aim it at the GCC sub-region only, or can it be applied in other regions in the world as well, even in the global north? This is the question that was put to you. Do you think that it can have a general validity, this question? What do you think? I know that it is difficult to answer, but what are your first reflections about that?
Mm-hmm. So I'll answer that question. I wanted a tiny comment to what Shadin said, and I actually agree completely with Shadin that the foundation is kind of to preserve, the definition of a refugee and encourage states to recognize refugees. And I think the standpoint where I'm coming from is, what if states don't? Where we have a situation where states actually, it would be very difficult to get them to recognize, to sign any binding treaty on refugees. So what do we do with the situation we have at hand? And I agree, obviously, that we don't know what could be the impact of kind of introducing this complementary thing where it's labor migration plus, protections for people from that are recognized as, not being able to return home. But I think it's, in a sense, in the interest of pragmatism and kind of the research that I've done here and the people who I've seen who actually need protection but have come here as labor migrants, and there's not going to be this recognition. They're not going to be resettled, or it's going to be very difficult for them to be resettled and get recognized as refugees. What do you do with that category that is not an insignificant category? And so for that reason, I felt that the GCR kind of provides this avenue where we recognize that it's this temporary initiative, that it's, within this framework, that it provides this kind of protection, and also provides opportunity. And it helps to perhaps fill the gaps where certain countries, it doesn't appear, at least not in the short term or in the medium term, that they're going to sign any binding treaty that that they have to abide by, where they have to recognize a certain definition of refugees and accord them certain rights. So with regards to the question that was asked in terms of, is this a broader idea? I mean, I think, like you said, it's kind of a difficult question to ask, and it's something that needs to be looked at. Like, if we do kind of expand it to encompass many different wealthier countries, will that somehow, like, Shadin was saying, blur the lines? Maybe these people would be better protected under refugee status, but now it's going to be labor migration. Are their rights going to be eroded? We're not sure. So I think it's something definitely that, for me, I can't give like a yes or no answer, but I would say for the region that I'm, working in right now, that the things that I see, that these countries are not party to the 1951 convention. However, they are wealthy. However, they do welcome different kind of migrants and expatriates. That the idea seems more perhaps fit for this context. But I don't think also that we should exclude it from other contexts and other wealthier countries. So I'm also working on a project about providing digital skills for refugees and enabling them kind of remote work opportunities. And not only that, but to get them trained in kind of the in-demand skills in wealthier countries that actually that they are able to acquire transferable skills that enables them to kind of to move to other countries, whether that is as refugees or whether that is as labor migrants. So I think all of these ideas definitely have potential to be expanded, and to ensure that that a person, whether they are or not recognized as a refugee, they do have the opportunity to be able to kind of to live a dignified life. So definitely, I think there's potential. I think I didn't answer that question so directly, but I think it needs definitely more thinking about and kind of looking at the different contexts to see if it could work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now I turn the last intervention by Dr. Kawar. This exchange, I think, touches on something that I know is close to your heart, which is the question of employment. So what do you think about access of refugees to labor markets of the countries where they are hosted? Irrespective of the Jordan Compact, access of refugees in general, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Jordan, access of refugees so that they can take care of themselves and they can contribute. As Shadin has said, refugees can also contribute, and we have seen in many different countries in the global north how migrants, how refugees have contributed to facing up to COVID-19. So refugees at times, those who sought asylum from Syria, highly skilled who sought asylum in Europe, have been able to contribute and have been integrated in the labor market. So what do you think about that?
Thank you for asking a question that is close to my heart, Dr. Ibrahim. First of all, let me say that a country like Jordan or Lebanon did not choose neither the number or profile of refugees they have. And some of them are skilled and can contribute, of course, but a majority of them are low-skilled population. In Jordan, most of the refugees came from the Dir'a area and the Eastern Desert, and it is a semi-nomadic region with low education level. You look at Canada and the UK, they are accepting refugees that have skills and have education. And while Jordan has 650,000 refugees, we did not choose their profile. The Canadians chose the profile of the 20,000 refugees. So there is already an imbalance here when we talk about employment. Now, my view was, before I joined government and when I was with the ILO, is that as long as any country, whether Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey, does not address the livelihood needs of the refugees are going to be working anyway. And if they work anyway without formal recognition, they are going to deregulate the labor market. They are going to press the wages down and increase informality and increase abuse and discrimination. So it is a non-starter that we need to acknowledge the need of refugees for work, and for the government to maintain a regular labor market, to be able to manage the labor market, they need to provide the refugees with formal work permits. That is one. Two, I am more knowledgeable, and in fact, the situation in Lebanon and Jordan tells us that exactly. In Jordan, Syrians have work permits in sectors. So the government said, okay, fine, but they will be allowed to work in sectors that there is a demand and that they will not compete with Jordanians, which was manufacturing, agriculture, construction. And in those, you know that the Syrian worker will get the minimum wage, will have a work permit, in fact, can be even registered in Social Security. Lebanon has been flooded with low-skilled, low-wage Syrians that had destabilized and displaced low-skilled, low-wage Lebanese. It has deregulated the labor market and compressed the wages. And I don't think this happened in Jordan. In the beginning, the Jordanians, it was very hard to convince them about this because the discussion started way before the Global Compact. The Jordan Compact. It was the recommendation of the ILO and UNHCR at the time and UNDP, and we did a lot of service to demonstrate to the Jordanians that, listen, if you don't do something now, there will be a high price to pay later because they will need to work sooner or later. That's one. And you need to protect your own as well. So a formal Syrian worker in the textile industry, let's say, will be working alongside a Jordanian in the textile sector, rather than the Syrian will be working informally and the Jordanian low-skilled will be displaced. Surveys that were done with the Norwegian organization FAFO and ILO, there were two surveys, I think, one in 2014, which I was involved in, and then one more recently, maybe 17 or 18, did prove that Syrian labor in Jordan is not displacing Jordanian labor. And I think it is because there has been a policy towards it and acknowledgement by the authorities. And also because this was part of a lot of the employment-related development programs. So if you have an infrastructure improvement project in the north, usually funded by the Germans to improve roads or schools, it would be a percentage that goes to Syrians and a percentage goes to Jordanians. And that was the conditionality of these employment-related funding projects. I hope I answered enough.
You did. Thank you very much. I think we have 1 minute remaining. So I'd like to thank you, the three of you, Jinan Bastaki, Shadan Khalaf, Mary Kawar, for a brilliant panel. In fact, we have been lucky to have two great panels, this panel and the first one. First one was about policies and institutions and for protection, and this one was about international cooperation, which is also aimed at protection. They were complementary. I think we have listened to brilliant ideas, reflections, and critical reflections at that. I hope that this is our valued contribution to the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the Statute of the UNHCR, of the establishment of the UNHCR itself. I would like to thank the global network, the global academic network for promoting this celebration. I wish we had more time because there are so many questions from the audience, but I hope that with your contributions, the three of you, with the contribution of the four panelists, we have made a good contribution, as I said, to this celebration from the MENA region, the most affected at present by refugee flows. I hope that we'll have an opportunity to do a transnational workshop like this. Other regions also are battered by refugee flows at present. Maybe we can all benefit from each other in order to advance the cause of refugees, the refugees that fall in between cracks of the ever-rising walls between nation states in the international system. The refugees are the victims of these ever higher walls. Let's ask nation states to take care of them in order to solidify their own system, and let's recognize also the transnational exchanges, transnational currents of people, of ideas, and of goodwill. Thank you very much to all, and hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bing.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mary.
And thank you very much to the audience.
Bye.
And thanks very much to the audience who stayed.
And the
with
great
us
questions
all this
from
time.
the audience.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.